These empty streets tell a story. If you listen carefully in the background, you might be able to hear the faint sound of gunshots. So the question is, where exactly is this from? And how on earth did we get here? Let me take you back to the fateful day of Friday the 5th, November 2010. It was the streets of Matamoros, Mexico, just on the border of Brownsville, Texas. The roads were empty. Not a single soul dared to look outside their windows. The busiest part of the town was still, with entire blocks riddled with bullet holes and the roads strewn with rubble that crumbled under tires. The only sound that tore through the deadly silence was the sharp fire of bullets. And this was the day of the war. There were grenades, helicopters, and Mexico's Marine forces trying to capture one of the most feared drug lords in Mexico. A man who earned his nickname from his lack of conscience and his affinity for torture. Antonio Ezequiel Cardenas Guillen, or as his admirers would call him, Tony Tormenta, was being hunted down. You may have heard about the crimes of El Chapo, El Mencho, and Pablo Escobar, but when it came to dangerous criminal activity, Tony Tormenta was not one to hold back either. But the Mexican government was prepared. If I were to tell one thing about that day, it is this: the state had it all planned for months on end. 6 months of intense intelligence gathering, several hundred spies combing towns and cities for Tony Tormenta, and a $7 million bounty on his head. $5 million by the U.S. authorities who had indicted him for drug trafficking charges, and $2 million by the Mexican government, which was simply sick of the lawlessness these drug cartels had spread in the country. This is what it took to put down one of the most feared drug lords in Mexican cartel history. You must be wondering one thing: what exactly earns you a $7 million bounty on your head in Mexico? You see, Tony Tormenta wasn't just an ordinary drug trafficker. He was one of the highest-ranking members of the Gulf Cartel, one of the oldest drug cartels in Mexico, which was started all the way back in the 1930s. His family had been running a prominent faction of the cartel for nearly 2 decades. Under his leadership, the Gulf Cartel transformed into one of the most terrifyingly invincible drug cartels in Mexico, with a network of operatives and spies that seemed to exist everywhere: West Africa, Asia, Europe, Central America, South America, and the United States, all of whom were under the control of this one man. When it came to the transportation, distribution, and sale of drugs into the U.S., Tony Tormenta was the one pulling the strings of the Gulf Cartel. So when Felipe Calderón came to power as the president of Mexico, he decided to put his foot down. Mexico had been ravaged by drug cartels for far too long. The Mexican forces were crippled. Drug lords, including Tony Tormenta, had bought out many of the corrupt government officials and police and army officers, enticed them with luxuries and fortune, and just like that, they had the government dancing in the palm of his hand. For Calderón, it was time to get rid of all the drug cartels once and for all. One of the drug leaders with the biggest target on his back was Tony himself. He knew his days were numbered, so he did what every drug lord being chased by the Mexican state does. Tony Tormenta vanished from plain sight. For 6 months, nobody knew where he was. One of the most wanted drug traffickers by the Mexican government, Tony Tormenta flitted from town to town, his location kept under wraps, and disclosed to only his most loyal of men. But eventually, the Mexican state caught up to him. A few weeks before his death, they received intelligence that he was hiding in a safe house in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico. They were finally on his scent. Within a matter of hours, his hiding place was surrounded by Mexican forces. After months of being nothing more than an elusive ghost, on that violent Friday afternoon on November 5th, 2010, at 3:30 p.m., he was sighted on the streets, ambushed, cornered like a rat, and on the verge of running over to the Texas border. In fact, just check out this small clip from that battle in Matamoros. It's just insane, and all this lasted for 8 hours. You must be wondering, all this just for one man? But Tony Tormenta did not quite start off helpless. He didn't exactly have a couple of lackeys with barely any training firing at the highly trained, disciplined Mexican Navy. No, Tony Tormenta had a private army of his own, called Los Escorpiones, who came to help him with 80 SUVs. The shots you hear aren't just from the Mexican Marines, they're also from Tony's own soldiers. Cold and ruthless, this army stopped at nothing to protect the man that was their leader. One thing about Tony Tormenta was that he, no matter the circumstances, always matched eye for eye. It took the Mexican Navy 660 Marines, 3 helicopters, 17 armored military-grade vehicles, and 8 hours of intense, violent, and relentless gun shooting to bring Tony Tormenta to his last breath. The inhabitants of the city were locked up in their houses and given intense warnings on social media, telling their neighbors that whatever you do not step a foot out the main door. The streets were a bloodbath. From Tony's side, there was heavy fire from gunmen concealed in the houses, automatic weapons fire from his men hidden in trucks, and a shower of grenades that went on for hours on end. After the deaths of more than 40 people, including 3 Marines, 1 journalist, and 4 of Tony's gunmen, both sides were exhausted. But some unofficial sources have told that more than 100 people died that day. Neither side had the battle in their hands. Neither was ready to lay their armor down. The stakes had never been higher. Time was inching closer. The final blow was about to hit. It was around 5:30 p.m., and before you knew it, the Marines took a breath, took their aim, and shot him dead. It was these surviving Marines that watched the body of one of the most wanted drug lords, the man that they knew as Antonio Ezequiel Cardenas Huillen, crumple like a ragdoll right before their eyes. After years of chase, months of intelligence, and 2 hours of ceaseless battle, Tony Tormenta was dead. The days following the death of this notorious drug lord were strange. Rival cartel, the Zeta cartel, in their glee, put up banners and posters celebrating Tony Tormenta's death. There were concerns that the death of one of the biggest leaders of the Gulf cartel had empowered the Zetas, which was a drug gang of hitmen formed from Mexican soldiers who previously had turf battles with the Gulf cartel. These turf battles, occurring at the northeastern border with the U.S., sometimes were on the verge of a full-blown war. The rise of the Zetas had been particularly concerning as this gang, ladies and gentlemen, was arguably more brutal and ruthless than other drug cartels. They had carried out beheadings and massacres of nearly 72 migrants from South and Central America by August of 2010. What perhaps might be the most surprising part of it all was that the Zetas were the creation of Tony's brother himself. They had split from the Gulf cartel years ago and grew into formidable rivals. The unique nature of the Mexican cartel problem was that you cut off one head and 3 more grow in its place. But still, there was a cause for celebration. The death of Tony Tormenta was met with rejoicing all across the country and even resulted in a message of congratulations from the U.S. President Barack Obama to the Mexican president. This particular death was so monumental in Mexico's war on drugs that the National Security Chief of Mexico, Alejandro Poira, declared Tony's death a major success that would significantly weaken drug cartels that had previously been generating an annual revenue of $40 billion in narcotic sales with the U.S. Whether this is an accurate assessment or simply something that government gave the public to celebrate over, this death, in the eyes of both the state and the public, was seen as a clear success. Tony Tormenta's death brought justice to hundreds of victims that met their untimely death because of the whims of this one man. And there it was. The legacy of the once powerful Cardenas family was finally splintered. After that day in November 2010, the Gulf cartel divided into factions. one led by Mario Cardenas Guillen and the other led by a former lieutenant. But the family's control over the cartel had grown weak beyond repair. Things would never be the same again. In 2012, Mario was arrested and locked up in Mexican prison for years. Mario was succeeded by his brother Homero Cardenas Guillen, who soon died from a heart attack in 2014. His place was then taken over by their cousin, Alfredo Cardenas Martinez, aka El Contador, or the Accountant. Alfredo has been arrested 3 different times since 2018. His last arrest made the U.S. urge the Mexican government to extradite him, where he would meet the same fate as the rest of the Cardenas family, either killed or locked behind the 4 walls. The castles, which the family had been building for decades on end and protecting more fiercely than their own lives, seemed to crumble right before our eyes. As for Tony Tormenta, his death led to an example that sometimes it does not matter how much power you hold in the palm of your hand. It does not matter how many men beg and grovel at your feet. Once the bullet hits, you're nothing more than someone from the past.